Welcome to the archive, Peter. How you doing today?
Oh, very good. Thank you. Yourself?
Good, good.
All right.
All right, so we're going to talk about trains today.
Okay.
And so when did you get started with trains?
Well, since age of cognizant, I guess. My grandfather on the maternal side worked for the Baldwin Locomotive Company, and also the American Locomotive Company, which is steam engines back in the late 1800s, 1900s. He died in 1973 or 70, somewhere around there. He died. But so that's the family. Dad worked for the New York Central when he was in college before the war, and then for the New Haven Railroad when he got back from the war. So we basically grew up in a railroad family.
Okay, so it's been somewhat of a family tradition.
Yes. My late older brother, James, not Junior, but James W., worked. He was the second guy in the family. There's 4 boys. I'm number 3. The oldest, Jay, called Jay, started working for Amtrak, basically when Amtrak started up in Vermont.
Around what time?
1971.
1971.
They had the Vermonter, actually it was a Montrealer back then. So somewhere in that time frame, he got a job with Amtrak.
Okay.
Up there, Dad was still working for, at that time he was working for Penn Central Transportation Company trustees, and dissolving the company. He was working down in Philadelphia with the board of directors and whatnot. Penn Central got bought out by Conrail. Penn Central had previously bought out New Haven Railroad, for whom he had worked his career up to that point for 20, 30 years. I don't know how many years. I'd have to do the math. But anyway, so he was working in the rail industry up until he retired as a consultant for Duluth Cather Parsons. I was doing work for the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, which was, I started working on with Amtrak in 1977, and that Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, NESIP, had started somewhere in that time frame, 78, maybe 79.
And had you worked anywhere else prior to Amtrak?
Oh, yes. So I picked apples at a orchard in Hamden, Connecticut, summer job or fall job, just, during high school, junior high school. Okay. But I got paid for it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any jobs in the train business?
My first rail job was when I was in college. So I graduated high school in '69. That year was working, so I'm 19 years old, and I was old enough to work for the railroad, so I worked summers for, at that time, it was Penn Central Transportation Company, Penn Central, as a flagman ticket collector. The flagman is a person at the end of the train responsible for the little lights that you might see at the end of a train, and locking up the train at the end of the run between primarily Stamford, Connecticut, and Grand Central Terminal, and make 2 round trips a day. And occasionally I'd go up to New Canaan or Danbury, even a New Haven job. I was obviously a first year summer employee. I was very low in the union seniority. So I got jobs, whatever was left over. The high paying jobs went to the senior employees. Okay. But anyway, so I was doing that for the summer. Start sometime after school let out, late May, until I had to get back. I was going to Windham College at the time in Putney, Vermont. It's no longer there, but it failed. But anyway, that was 2 summers working for Penn Central Transportation Company.
And did you have to join a union in order to work?
Yep. It was a union job. I have a CER number, which I'm not sure what that means, but it was my identifier. And it's a funny thing, I started working for Amtrak in '77, and there's a lot of conductor transportation type people that I was working with. I was in management, but at the time, and I would twit them that I have seniority rights back to 1969, and these guys some of them were younger than I was, and they're sort of looking at me, and I said, yeah, I can buy those back. I think there was some provision. I could buy my time back and go back in the union, but I never did that. So anyway, that was 2 years with Penn Central, and then I had a hiatus from the rail industry. When I graduated from Wyndham College, I had a degree in psychology. I was working in a psychiatric hospital in Brattleboro, Vermont, and that lasted for a few years until I realized I didn't have advanced degrees and I wasn't going to get advanced degrees to continue on in a professional medical field. So I ended up back at our house in Connecticut, the family house in Connecticut, Hamden, working at Quinnipiac University for a year or so, not even a year maybe. And Dad called up or contacted me somehow or other that Amtrak is hiring. Mm-hmm. It was newly formed in 71. This is 74, 75, somewhere around there. I guess closer to 77, really, because 77. Because I went down to in New Haven, to the old general office building. They had offices there. I think that's where it was. Or maybe it was State Street. I think it was State Street, the YMCA. But anyway, I did an interview in the signal department. And so that's electronics. I had already gotten my amateur radio license, and so I was familiar with hobbyist electronics. And that was very beneficial, getting a job with the signal department in Amtrak.
Okay.
So I was hired right away.
So the signal department with Amtrak, what was that department entirely devoted to?
Well, they called it communications and signals. So they have the wires that go along, the telephone poles that go along the side of the tracks with communication and power. And so that was the communication side, the pole line, basically. Or any buried cables for fiber optic. There wasn't much in fiber optic back in 77. But that was the communication side, and
did you guys maintain these telephone poles?
construct and maintain.
Construct and maintain.
Or take down. Actually, a lot of the poles are Western Union Telegraph, and it was abandoned. Mm-hmm. So they had power on some of them, signal power on some of the lines. So those would be maintained. But I was working more in the signal side of the communications and signal department. So we were installing new signal system, updating the system from many years ago. The signal system was put together back starting at when they invented electricity, I guess you'd say. But we'll say the 30s or 40s, it had, some of it was quite antiquated. Cables would deteriorate, that sort of thing. So trenching in, digging. Was working up in Springfield in back of the jail, Springfield, Massachusetts, and dig and trench for new signal cables going to a signal location, and from a box, a control box, it connects to the rails. The train comes along and tells the signal system inside the box what's going on. The signal system sends a signal message up to the signal itself, the train signal, the red and green signal, turn red, turn green, turn yellow. That sort of system, the traffic control system. And so I was doing that for a while. I got sent to electronics school, RETS school, Radio Electronic Technical School in Boston, Mass, for a couple of weeks. And that's, again, a union job. Most of the labor is unionized in the railroad. Mm-hmm. Management is not. And at some point, probably after maybe 6-8 months working in the signal CNS department, they called it the CNS department, out of New Haven, I got word that they were going to, I was in a class, they called a class of about 70 new hires. That's when I got hired, 77, 76 of us, 75 of us, something like that, were hired. And the management told us, the Holiday Inn in North Haven, that there's work enough for us for the rest of our lives, which is true. The infrastructure needed help. It had been neglected for many years because of bankruptcies of the New Haven Railroad. The Conrail was not too interested in doing anything that they didn't have run freight on. There's a passenger line, and so that's where Amtrak took over the passenger lines.
And so what were the passenger lines?
The ones I was working on was exclusively between New Haven, Connecticut, and Springfield. Amtrak owned New Haven to Springfield in Massachusetts, and New Haven to Boston. And that was basically it.
And that was to transport people?
Yeah, it's passengers. There's freight. It's mixed bag.
Okay.
The Providence and Worcester Railroad runs freight. CSX, they call it now, Railroad runs from New Haven area.
And freight is what gets supplies or materials?
Yeah, you'll see them out here on the, they call it what is this, where the Downeaster runs, Western Route Main Line.
Yeah.
Or the freight route. That runs, it's now CSX, but it has been for many years. It was Boston and Maine, and then it got bought out as Pan Am, Springfield Terminal, Guilford Rail System, various names. It was all the same thing, Freight Railroad, and that's of course where the Downeaster runs. So it's the same sort of thing. It's a shared right-of-way, but the railroad was owned and maintained by Amtrak between New Haven and Boston and New Haven and Springfield, and from there went to different railroads. And so that was my territory. Started working out of New Haven office. So we were broken down to 3 offices. So I'm in the signal department, and so we had offices in Providence and New Haven, headquarters, Springfield, signal department. But anyway, so we have all these new hires. We're going to be working for the rest of our lives in the signal department. And the next thing I know, we're getting furlough notices that not being fired, but we're cutting back staff. And as a union employee, I have union rights to bid on any job where I have enough seniority to hold that position. Well, having just started a few months prior to, I didn't have enough seniority to do anything like that. A couple of people did. They ended up going to New York City. Amtrak runs the railroad from New York, actually New Rochelle, down to Hellgate Bridge, down to Washington. So people sort of filtered around. I had an opportunity to get promoted to management. And that came about because I was laid off and I had to do something, or was going to be laid off. And a position came available. Of course, everybody knows about this layoff. So I went out to Philadelphia, interviewed with the chief engineer for the engineering department of Amtrak. And, so he wanted to know why I am. And I think he sort of knew because Dad was still working, and I think he was working for Amtrak at that time. So he transitioned into Amtrak probably in 73, 74. I'm not sure when he got into Amtrak. And so I got the job. I was promoted to management, which was a big deal. The same day that the signal department, the union guy came around, wanting me to sign off to get my dues automatically deducted from my paycheck. Well, I'll think about this. Let me see if I get the job. I got the job. So I never joined the union in Amtrak. And my union position with Penn Central was long gone. It's like 4 or 5 years prior to. And I had not maintained my dues. So anyway, I'm working at Amtrak in the engineering department out of New Haven as a construction inspector. Amtrak had a big program. I was talking about the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project that was going full bore at that time, and various little projects. It sounds like big. It is a big scope for the whole Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor. But where we were, there was a few jobs, one of which was a jobs bill funded project to clear the right-of-way. So the tracks and all the maintenance debris left over from years of maintenance and just throwing stuff off to the side. The right-of-way property, Amtrak property, was pretty messy. Trees were growing up, the way you see the tree crews working, clearing trees around the power lines today. It was the same sort of thing. There were trees and dead and branches and all that stuff. So Amtrak hired a contractor to do this work, which got the union boys all upset, and rightfully so. But they didn't have this tools, equipment. Amtrak did not have the tools, equipment, machinery to do a cleanup and get it done during reasonable weather conditions. And so they made an agreement with the union, and the union had certain tasks that they could do, and they did do that as under this program. And we in the construction department hired a bunch of minority contractors working on the northeast corridor between New Haven, and we had another engineering construction department in Providence, and another one in Boston. Hired 3 different contractors, I think 3 or 4 different contractors, to do all this cleanup of the right-of-way. So I was assigned as an inspector, daily job to make sure they're doing what they're told to do and what they're supposed to do, make sure we tell them the right things to do, because it changes. You get to a certain location and the property line is here, but you can't do that because it's too steep, it's all rocks, so what are you going to do? So it's things like that. So that was 78, started in management. As I say, I didn't last long in the signal department. And 81, 83, 84, 85, I'm not sure exactly when I started. That jobs program fizzled out, funding ran out. And I was working with what they call individual and commercial. And what that means is if you're a property owner on both sides of the railroad and you want to get back and forth across the railroad, you have to go through the railroad. If you want to go across, up, over, under, whatever, run a wire across, it doesn't matter what it is, the railroad wants to know about it and they want to collect their money to do it. And so I was working on that department, that function, I should say. It's all in the engineering department. So I was working a lot on this orphan bridge program. And what that was is the railroad overbridges, I should say the highway bridges over the railroad, overhead bridges. We call them overhead bridges, or overhead our railroad, were built by the New Haven Railroad typically and not maintained for many years. And some of them were just abandoned or closed, one thing and another, or they had to be maintained. And as a result of the deterioration, the state stepped in. The state in the state of Connecticut is where I was working at the time. So in that connection, the state owned, of course, the highway bridges. You can imagine I-91 goes over several times. Route 84 in Hartford, it's all over the railroad. So there was no question about who owned and maintained those bridges. But these orphan bridges, or little town bridges, I don't know if you're familiar with Exeter here, Park Street.
Yeah.
It's a little one-way bridge. It looks like it's not in very good shape. That was a typical orphan bridge in the state of Connecticut that the state paid to get them rehabilitated and brought up to more or less standards at the time, which I say is in the 80s. And so we had contractors, I say we, the state had contractors all over the place, taking out the bridge, redecking it, doing whatever they have to do. That included utilities, because there's always a water line or a power line or something going over, all those kind of things. So that was the Orphan Bridge program. Also, there's grade crossing improvements, and the railroad maintains what's under their tracks and their property line, but the rest of it's up to the town. The town says this railroad crossing is a mess. I don't know how familiar you are around here, but there's a few railroad crossings that have been replaced in the last few years here in Exeter. And they work with its railroad. The town works with the railroad. They go in there and they pave. The railroad does their thing, takes out the old material, puts in new material. And they get reimbursed for it. The railroad gets reimbursed for it. And so a bunch of grade crossings. Some of them are eliminated. There's one every quarter of a mile in the towns of Wallingford, Meriden, Connecticut. There's crossings all over the place. And some of them they just take out, try to build a bridge, over, under. So I was involved in that program, industrial and commercial. So the commercial, of course, would be considered to be a state or a business. Pratt & Whitney owned a bridge. It was a big airframe, at least engines. I think they're making, anyways, aircraft industry, Pratt & Whitney. They got a bunch of big factories around in Connecticut, a lot of which got, some of them which got closed. But anyway, so we had to go talk with the chief engineer for the Pratt & Whitney. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And who's, and the whole process to make sure they understand what the railroad requires, how they're going to pay for it, and how we're going to monitor the work of their contractor doing work over our railroad. And the same thing goes with fiber optic cable. The television companies were building fiber optic systems all around the place. Cablevision, same thing. So there's a lot of that going on for many years. It still goes on a daily basis. But then we got into a bridge replacement, bridge rehabilitation program. And in Connecticut, again, I'm working out of the New Haven office, living in Clinton, Connecticut. I'm married at that time. We got married in '78. Kids started coming in 1980. So I was working 7 to 3:30, basically contractor hours, which is much better than I was in the transportation department, where I was subject to call at any time to go anywhere for any train. It was very disruptive if you're a young lad, which I was at the time, and you can't do anything that's going to interfere with my performance on the trains. But working in the management in a 7 to or 9 to, let's say 9 to 5 or 7 to 3:30, whatever job, could much better control my. I had more control over my hours of work.
Yeah.
So that was good. So we got into this bridge replacement program in Connecticut. There's 5 movable bridges to go over. There's rivers, Connecticut River, Thames River. What else? Mystic River. I guess it's Mystic, Connecticut. Shaw's Cove, New London. So there's 5 of these movable bridges. Starting closest to New Haven is the Connecticut River Bridge, a massive bridge. All these bridges were built circa 1905, 1910, something like that, and had not been terribly well maintained. So that was my first assignment, was working on these existing movable bridges, upgrading them to make them more reliable. They'd fail, and boat owners would get upset about it. The commercial in Groton, it's the Navy is there, the sub base, and if they can't get through the bridge, they get very upset about that. Coast Guard regulates the bridges. The water was there before the railroads, so the water people have right of way over the railroads. So the railroads have to stop when a boat calls for a opening. And if it doesn't go up, then everybody gets upset. And they weren't going up on a regular basis reliably. They were going up, and then sometimes they wouldn't come down, get stuck. And there's...
Do you know what people would have to do if they got stuck?
Well, it depends who you were. If you were on the train, you'd either wait it out, or sometimes, depending on the severity of the problem, like if there's a major mechanical malfunction, these gears, huge gears broke, we'll say, or drive shaft broke, they'd get buses. Mm-hmm. And so there's a station on this side, a station on that side, and you get on the bus and go to Boston, or get on a bus and go to New York, something like that. And the boat owners, if they could lower their antennas and masts and all that kind of stuff, they could go under, depending on the bridge. The Navy submarines, some of the smaller class submarines, could sneak under the bridge. They got very close to the bottom of the channel, which is a very soft mud, and it gets sucked up into their heat exchangers for the reactors and whatever else. So they weren't too excited about that. They could only go at a high tide or mid tide or something. Not exactly sure when they were best to go through underneath the bridge. And this is in Thames River Bridge in New London, Groton.
Yeah.
So I worked on those bridges, all of them getting rehabilitated. And Niantic Bridge was Niantic River, Niantic, Connecticut, East Lyme, Old Lyme. It's chain drive. There's a big chain cog down at the bottom, below the track level, giant chain going up to the movable span, and that would roll back and down, up and down. And again, it's all 1900s technology, and signal system had been updated, motors been replaced, and that was the projects that I was working on, updating the mechanical electrical systems for these bridges.
And so 1900s technology, this is like, what, battery operated?
No, they some of them were, I would say electricity was going by then. So they had electric motors, maybe with a gasoline engine as emergency backup, or to run auxiliary functions. They had air brakes. I think in the Thames River Bridge they had air brakes. So they had a compressor, gasoline, and then they developed over time. So basically they're all electric with diesel generator backup, if there was a power outage of any sort. We're getting commercial power. It wasn't our own power. We're buying the power from the towns. And so no, they're all, I never saw any bridge other than run by electrical motors, but they're old motors. And I don't know if they have these things, they call them trolley controllers, trolley car. You can imagine the motorman standing up in front of the trolley car with this lever that goes around a semicircle, and it's from slow to fast. And then it goes the other half of the semicircle, and it's reverse. And it's just a bunch of relays and wires all over the place to run the electric motor at different speeds and different directions. Obviously, you got to go up and down. And when I started getting involved with the rehabilitation of these bridges, Thames River particularly was a big one, is a big bridge, rehabilitating the electrical system, it was using, I would say, relay logic, which are relays on or off. So it's digital. You can think of it as digital, Boolean logic. So if and the, then, or. So if the signal is at red, if the derails were set to derail, then you can open the bridge. So all these conditions had to be met, and then the bridge would open. And the same thing when the bridge closed, if everything closed, locked up, there's locks, then the trains could run. It's all just relay logic. And as time went on, of course, now everything that was in that relay room, the size of this table, is now in the that size. It's all microprocessor today. And that was the second phase of my work on the bridges, where we were replacing the bridges. They were just too far gone. We had to replace them. And so we did Mystic as a swing bridge, Shaw's Cove as a swing bridge. And they're very close to the water, and the steel was getting rusted by the saltwater condition environment. New submarine cables, they had to bury the cables, go underneath the river for all the communication and power to get out to the center where the bridge spins, and then to the other side where the signals are on both sides. So I was involved with both the replacement of those projects. Not all full time. That was sort of like filling in on nights and weekends. I was doing that industrial commercial work mostly during the day. And then we got to Thames River Bridge. It was a massive project. It was a rolling, what was it? Well, it was I forget the type of bridge it was, but basically it had huge trunnions, bearings. Those bearings would be as big around as just the shaft, and then on the outside of this table, so there'd be maybe a 3-foot, 4-foot diameter shaft, bearing, and on the outside the shell, the bearing shell, just like in a car, you have special metals they use, bronze for the bearing surfaces, so it's this polished steel shaft going across for the bearing, and then massive bronze blocks that had to be greased routinely, and they're all worn, terribly worn. It sounded like the Jurassic Park when one of those dinosaurs is coming, boom, 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 when it opened and closed, boom, boom, because there's a stiction. Call it stiction, where the bearing sticks and then it releases, sticks and it releases. And bridge wasn't coming down in the same place, it was uneven wear. So basically, with the help of a Chimbro corporation out of Maine, we replaced the lift span at Thames River. And that was a big ordeal working with the Coast Guard because, again, there's a subbase upriver and there's a dry dock upriver, the only one in the Long Island Sound, only one between Boston and New York or something, this dry dock for the ferries. So we were told. And so we had to close the channel to take out the old span and put in a new span. And that was supposed to last only 10 days or something. And ran into some significant problems with the demolition of the old lift span. And so it ended up being more like a month, which, you know, if anything happens with the submarines, they'd be in trouble. They can't get the thing out to sea. But what the Navy, and they're not stupid people, they knew to get their big boats out. And so they had boats upriver, and they'd come through, but the subs I'm talking about. But all their major assets were, you know, wherever, maybe up here in Portland, I don't know where they went, Georgia, maybe out on the West Coast. So there's really no issue. They didn't seem to be too upset. The commercial people were pretty upset. There's some tour boats and things like that that couldn't get underneath the bridge. But anyway, you replace this lift, the bascule type bridge with a vertical lift span, which means, I don't know if you know I don't know what's the name of that new bridge they just put up in across the Piscataqua like 5-10 years ago. It's got Shirley Temple Bridge or something. Sarah Long. So that's a vertical lift bridge, 4 posts, and a span goes up and down. That's basically what we built around the existing bridge to keep it going, and then we put up this, floated in. And then we went from that bridge to Niantic. Again, there's a chain drive bridge, replaced that. Same team. We had contractors, inspectors, engineering groups that were supporting our efforts to make sure that we did what needed to be done in the most time and cost-efficient way. And because, you know, Amtrak's a very highly politicized entity, and the Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera. So we did Niantic, and the same sort of thing, took out the old span and put in a new one, actually a new bridge on a new alignment. So the old bridge, we ran it up until D-Day and H-hour and shut it down, and H-hour plus 1, we opened up the new alignment, cut over both ends of the railroad. The railroad that we rebuilt, probably 1.5 miles of new railroad adjacent to the existing railroad. And I say on D-Day and H-hour, we cut both ends over to the new system, which at that time was now electrified. We had electrified the railroad in 2000. Completed the project in 2000. So we had electric railroad, had a little complexity. So that was my time with the bridges. In between, I was trying to think, I was working in the Industrial Commercial Department. In 95, the electrification project came online. So I, of course, was interested in working with that, and they were hiring a lot of people, Amtrak and consultants, and building up the staffing to run this huge, huge project, electrifying the railroad from New Haven to Boston. And the railroad is already electrified from New Haven Railroad is electrified from New Haven to New York, and the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time was electrified from New York to Washington. So we were just filling in this gap up at the north end, running new wires, whole new system. So I worked on that job, 95 to 2000. That came to a halt. We finished the project. We were running new high-speed Acela service, 150 mile an hour trains, all electrified railroad using European technology, a very robust system that was put in. And so that job came to an end, and I was able to transfer into the safety department, working again on the Boston division, Boston region of the railroad. So I had offices in New Haven. A guy left the safety department for whatever reason. He got promoted to transportation department, I think. So I took his position. I was working there 2 years. I came up here when the Downeaster began, helping train the first responders on the characteristics of the equipment, the rail equipment. It's much different than freight railroad. It's these passengers, got doors that open, windows that open, emergency access. They have heat, lights, all kinds of systems on the trains that are different from a freight train. So we were training people up and down the line between, well, I came here and I was up in Maine, Rigby Yard. We had a train set that we'd run around and show the people, the responders, how to safely access if there's a disaster. And that lasted for a couple of years. New president and new regime came in. Again, of course, always trying to save money and realize that safety is everybody's job. And so we don't need a safety department quite as many people. So I was furloughed in 2002. And as said before, I didn't have any union rights. Most of my cohort that got laid off from the safety department, furloughed, were able to find work back in their prior lives as a union track worker, a union signal worker, some kind of bridge worker, some kind of union job. I did not have any of that, but one of my associates called up one day after a couple of months institute teaching in Connecticut, and associate from Amtrak had found positions down in New York that I wasn't aware of. I mean, I was looking all the time for jobs. But he said, no, you got to call here. He gave me all the contacts. So I was working in New York City. We had as a consultant for Amtrak. So I was working with AECOM. There's a lot of different acronyms. The first company I was working with under that umbrella AECOM was URS, United Research Services. So there's a consultant, but I don't know, what's United Research Services? I don't know, URS. But anyways, all part of AECOM. And so I ended up getting an apartment in New Jersey, Weehawken. Actually, it was North Bergen, but the project was redoing, this is 1942. The tunnel was built under the Hudson River. There's a Hudson River, 2 tunnels, which now they have a big project to replace them. Ventilation system was being rehabilitated, and it was in Weehawken, New Jersey, right on the Hudson River, in the helix. They call it the helix, where 495 goes down and around and go into the Lincoln Tunnel to get into Manhattan. So I was down there, I rented an apartment down there for a couple of years, all the time looking to get back with Amtrak. The reason being, you have Social Security, I have railroad retirement. I have to work 1 day a month to qualify to get 30 years of railroad retirement service, and I have to be 60 years of age to get to retirement. So I'm working to that goal, and when I was working even though I was working for Amtrak, I was a consultant working for Amtrak. I was not collecting railroad retirement months. So I was always looking for a job, preferably back with Amtrak, because I knew people, et cetera, and eventually things opened up. And that's when I got back onto this in 2004, 2003, 2004. I got back to Amtrak working in Groton, Connecticut, at a maintenance base in Groton on these bridge projects. And I say they're massive projects, lots of millions of dollars being spent. And I was a project manager for these bridge replacement projects. So I was basically the face of Amtrak. And not to say I was the only Amtrak employee there, but I had people helping me in addition to consultants. The people I had worked with, AECOM, they came back, not the same people from New York, but many of the same people that worked over the years with Amtrak projects, smaller projects. So I had that going full bore till 2013, Niantic River Bridge project. Like I said, we replaced over a mile of railroad plus a new movable bridge in a very sensitive marine environment. And so when that wound down, the state of Connecticut realized that they could put back, or they should put back, a double track rail, make a single track railroad that had been a double track railroad back to being a double track railroad again between New Haven and Springfield, Massachusetts. And they had it's a huge, costly adventure to do that. And I was running out of work with Amtrak, so I went over to work as an Amtrak employee, as a project manager for that project. And during that time, I'd say around 2013, 2014, I became of age, I guess you could say. I think I actually started 2011, and I needed a couple more years of service and maybe age to get to 65. I actually ended up being over age, but it took me a while to get to 30 plus years of service, railroad retirement. So now I'm eligible for retirement from Amtrak as a railroad, and I felt it was my duty to open the way for younger people to come in and train them and get them going with Amtrak, which I did do with the help of my supervisor and the personnel department. And so I stopped working for Amtrak on Friday, December 31st, something like that, and started working back again with AECOM Monday, like January 3rd or whatever it was. In the same office for the same project, a Hartford line double tracking project. And now I was acting as a coordinator. Instead of a project manager, I was coordinating the efforts between the contractor, the state, and Amtrak to make sure everybody's doing their thing, including a whole new signal system. I don't know if you ever heard of positive train control, but after many years, over the years of rail collisions, accidents associated with trains running into other trains, they've upped the standards to make it more or less foolproof, as much as you can with technology, to force trains to stop, even if they don't want to stop, or they don't think they have to stop, or they think they can keep going. The driver thinks it's, I'm just going to go slow. No, you're not going to go at all. And it just stops them dead in their tracks until such time that the conditions change to allow them to go. So that's positive train control. So we were putting that in. So I was doing that for a couple of years. That project started to wear down. And in 2017, I was still working for the consultant AECOM. I was asked if I wanted to go to Boston because I wasn't needed anymore in Connecticut on this Hartford Line project. So that was the end of, I would say, Christmas 2017, something like that, December 2017. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll go. We have a daughter lives in Taunton, not too far from Boston, really. You think about it, it's the suburbs of Massachusetts. And her husband is in the National Guard. He was getting deployed to Kosovo in 2018. And I'm running out of work in Connecticut, and we got a little camper van. She's got a carport that'll fit a camper van and plug it in. I said, yeah, I'm going to Boston. And so I actually went to Taunton, working for the MBTA, as a consultant working for the MBTA. It's an extension of staff, basically, is what we were doing. The MBTA has a hard time hiring people to work for the MBTA. But they can hire consultants as they're temporary, and they just tell us to leave when they get fed up with our work or don't need us anymore. So in 2018, I was working for automatic fare collection for all the Purple Line, I call it the Purple Line trains, commuter rail stations. Every station in the state of Massachusetts was going to have automatic fare collection where you would take your mobile, hold it near I don't know what you call it, a little pad, and it would pay your fare and you get on the train. And when you got off, I guess maybe it had to do the same thing to get off so I knew how far you went, something like that. So I was just in the very early stages. All they wanted me to do was find out what they had for power at each station, like commercial power. Is there commercial power here? No, there's commercial power right over there at that pump station over there. Bring it over, we're going to use that to power this station. most of the stations had power of their own because they're a big station, a lot of passengers. So that was 2018. I worked for that January, February, finished up that project, the automatic fare collection, and morphed into, transitioned into the same company, MBTA, working positive train control. And that project had been going before, I don't know when it started, but sometime late 2017 or 2017. They had an Italian contractor coming over to build this electronic control system, positive train control. But MBTA needed inspectors, so we put together a team of inspectors, people that were familiar with railroad primarily, because that's where we were dealing with. We wanted people who wouldn't get run over by trains. So I was working for that up until basically Thanksgiving 2018. And the project was still going, but it was wearing down. It was winding down. All the infrastructure had been built, and they're fine-tuning the system and testing it, running test trains, that sort of thing, on all the purple lines. Again, this is the purple line, the commuter rail that I was assigned to all over the state. And 2018, they were running out of, they didn't need as many people working for them. The MBTA didn't need as many people. So I volunteered to leave, and got a invitation from my brother David, who lives out in Santa Monica, to go on a cruise to Antarctica, and been bugging me about it for a few years, actually, a year or so. So I signed on to go for a cruise for the month of December in Antarctica, and I haven't worked a day since.
All right. So that was your retirement party.
Yes, on the cruise.
Were you looking at the train stations when you had the chance?
Absolutely. So to that point, we flew into Buenos Aires while the G7, I think it was, the G20 was going on in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so I had to go find the railroad. We were there for a night, so we had a couple of days. I was waiting for Brother David to show up from California. So I just walked around the city and found an electrified railroad station. There's a Catton area, all this stuff is great. Nothing going on. The whole railroad system, buses, everything was shut down because of the G7 security issues, the G20, what it is. It's an economic group that gathers periodically. So I'm trying to communicate to these guys, when's the next train? When's the next train? They're sort of looking at me, no train. And that's why so I didn't get a photograph of any trains, but I did get photographs of the right-of-way, the station, grade crossing.
Yeah.
That's about it.
All right. Peter, so before we close this, is there anything you'd like to share with future generations?
Well, the thing I learned early on, Dad would complain about people who would come to him and say, this guy told me it's not his job to answer a question about the tracks, because he works with the bridges. And Dad would say, never say that. Say, listen, I'll get back to you. Pretend you know everything. But don't give him wrong answers, don't lie, but get back to him with the real deal. Nowadays, you can do that. Google search, I'll get back to you. You go to my mobile, check it out. The other thing people would say, I don't know anything about electricity. He says, and I'm working with interns, people from Northeastern, new hires, Amtrak would hire. I'm not familiar with electricity. I said, all right, we're talking here person to person. Don't ever say you don't know anything about electricity. The railroad runs on electricity. The whole world runs on electricity. Just say, I'll get back to you on that. They'll ask, well, why is that bulb out? Well, it's a three-phase bulb. What do you mean it's three-phase bulb? I don't know anything about electricity. Well, go find out. What is a sodium arc light or something? Whatever it is, a high-voltage light. Whatever it is, radio, same thing. I don't know anything about radios. Don't tell your manager or your coworkers you don't know anything about something. Yeah, get back to you on that. Wife was a teacher. She said the same thing. People would come to her and they'd ask her something, and her cohort there would say, I don't know anything about special education. Don't say that. Just say, well, let's go. Yeah, I'll find out. I'll let you know. And get back to them. And get back to them. So that's what got me through. I do not have an engineering degree, psychology and English. But I picked up the words and had some idea what I was doing with electronic stuff, being a radio amateur. And that was a very important thing in my career. One, to have some interest in different things, even though it's not my job. I didn't run the trains, but I knew how they worked. I didn't maintain the track, but I knew what they had to do to maintain the tracks. And so I could, fake it till I make it. And not do anything wrong. That was the key. Don't say something you don't know and send somebody down the wrong path. You can't do that. So that's about it, I would say, for people coming into the field. And right now, Amtrak's hiring, I think, 4,000 employees are looking for help because with the pandemic, et cetera, they need people to work the trains, to work the yards, work the offices, I don't know what all. And we got a massive project down in New York City that's just, and people, I don't want to go to New York City. That's a place to be. I lived over in Bergen there, had a little apartment, and it was great. Of course, at that time, the kids were out of the house. They're in college, whatnot. So it makes a difference. That's about it.
All right. Thank you, Peter.